You do the intro in 3, 2, 1.
Hello, everyone. This is Francis, Martin, and Curt for the Natural Law Institute. This is our NLI office hours Q&A today. I can't remember. We've been, Martin had to go and be splendorous on vacation, gloriously driving the borders of Czechia with his motorcycle, adventuring out like the real hero he is. And so we were delayed from having a Q&A during the past few weeks. But anyway, we've got I don't know, more than a dozen questions this week, right? Don't we? All set up. And I just want to let you know that I was a good boy for once. Martin and Francis are always dutiful. They always go through the questions. Martin usually answers most of them, but this is the first time I've actually answered my questions in advance, so I'm patting myself on the head. Anyway, all right. So usually what happens is we go through Francis reads the question. Martin usually gives you the right answer. And I add color or background if necessary. I'm going to comment on a few extra things today because I want you to. Want to emphasize Martin's insights. So let's go ahead. Start out.
All right. So, question 1. A component of the war being waged upon us is the intentional misdirection of the extremely potent resource, feminine empathy, care towards an outgroup, a competitor, ending up in a culture of treason. The misdirected care ends up cultivating and strengthening our competitors while leaving the in-group weak and unmotivated. I see this as a natural consequence of Christian tolerance and forgiveness exceeding the bounds of reciprocity. How does an NLI propose to limit, criticize, or restrict this type of treasonous behavior such that the surplus feminine resources are directed back to the in-group? And how does one police this?
Well, outlawing, public lying, and accountability for political decisions pretty much cover this. It's not further difficult to feed them the new and true propaganda, or there's a question whether we just want another managerial state with our people in management. I'd suggest not, but that we may have to wean our people off of it if at all possible, to create a managerial state that gets smaller over time.
Correct. The only color I'll add is that when Martin says outlawing public lying, accountability for political decisions, is that the way we look at it is we will equally suppress female antisocial, anti-economic, and anti-political behavior as much as we have male. We are just historically, for some reason, I still don't understand because it appears to be genetic, is that we are way more tolerant of the female antisocial means of antisocial behavior, which is how both the female population, the effeminate male population, and the hostile elites that have migrated to our country are able to make use of women by telling them what they want to hear and appealing to their instincts. So we've done quite a bit of work on on outlawing female behavior as thoroughly as male. The shock will be that once we do that, the huge difference in our public spaces that will occur in our education system and everything, because we're essentially criminalizing what's become the enemy's means of sedition and treason over the past 150, 67, 170 years. So it's going to be something else, but that's even over the past 170 years. If we go back to the Abrahamic sedition against the Greeks and the Romans, we've been fighting this problem for 2,500 years.
Well, while you're saying that, it actually made me thought of this. Is it like two sides of the same coin in that when you say why are we so susceptible to feminine antisocial behavior, so tolerant of feminine antisocial behavior, is it because that Western man has been so good at the masculine pursuits and also at detecting masculine antisocial
Correct.
behavior that they tend to turn a blind eye and dismissing the feminine antisocial behavior.
Well, if men are occupy the educational institutions, whether it be the church, the academy, or the state, right? And if men are the jurists, right, that resolve differences, and if men are somewhere between kings, governors, and legislators, right, you're going to get you don't have a vehicle for which women to be able to enact seditiously. You have to be able to do that. Their work is social destruction, not physical or political. They undermine, and so you have to get something that the magical thinking feminine mind wants to believe is possible and sell it. And it turns out that religion is the religion or its pseudoscientific equivalent, which is the Marxist feminist woke sequence. Those things sell. Believe it, it was weird to me that the original Marxist class warfare actually worked at all but that was dependent upon the ignorance of the population at the time. It's still surprising that people can believe it at all, even though it's only taught in nonsense courses. But you watch women and they'll believe anything that puts them in the victim position or the oppressed position, so that they have the intuition that they are righteous in expressing antisocial behavior as rebellion. And so it's basically the same thing as children. But when women do this, they do it in enough numbers with enough male leadership, in other words, the beta males that profit from it, and enough from frankly, it's Jewish intellectuals that come up with it. They have enough support, and now they have not only the education academy as propaganda, they've used that to get the political propaganda out there, and thirdly, they've got the media propaganda out there. So all the talking stuff has been seditious for a long time. And you add the incentive that women consume 70% of government resources, and that they spend 70% of household income, you end up with every incentive to pander to this particular antisocial behavior, that it's normal for women, that they actually are just hiding behind as a means to self-justify their seditious behavior, to undermine and achieve what they cannot by merit. And as you mentioned, Western man did solve the problem of politics uniquely, and did solve the problem of law uniquely. And so we ended up in a pretty good, serious advantage, except that every time we overexpand, which is the natural consequence of the wealth production that Western civilization is going to naturally produce, we either overexpand in the class dimension, which ends up being women, or we overexpand in the territorial dimension. Whereas, and we don't have, because we're not Chinese, who can expand in every direction, but they use indoctrination. The Americans, the Europeans expand, and we can't use indoctrination. First of all, because you could bring Asians and Europeans together, but you can't bring South Eurasians and Africans together into our system, because the demographic distribution is such that it's too much of a barrier for competition. So proximity creates hostility. So getting a little, I'm conscious of one of the later comments, so I feel like I'm getting a little off track here. But I mean, Martin's summary is, if we outlaw public lying and we institute accountability for display, word, and deed to the public, in the public, and matters public, most of which will consist of outlawing the feminine means of antisocial behavior, then whether it's from the Jewish intellectual side, which is, again, that's cognitively feminine, or from the beta males who take advantage of it, which is like the people who work in teaching in universities and media, or whether, the attention seekers, or if we get rid of that ability and we make people accountable for telling truth in public, I think we could fix it rather quickly. despite the fact that it will cause great internal turmoil, because you're telling a whole bunch of people that have learned to lie for a living or to sell false promises for a living that they no longer can make a living at it, and no criminal gives up his income stream without reluctance, so to speak. So I think it's going to be a socially and politically difficult time for the parasitic classes, whose very existence has been made possible by that which they seek to undermine. So that's my rant there.
Well, I once again suggest that we're not uniquely susceptible to this form of subversion, that it was corruption of the elites.
Yes.
And
Well, how come the Chinese didn't fall for it?
what was Maoist?
The Chinese historically have really reined in our women.
What?
Like the Chinese historically have really reined in our women, whether it's foot binding or not hypergamy. What's the other one? Polygamy, and essentially owning women almost as if they're your property, livestock, and so on. And I like to joke with white friends of mine that you guys screwed all up by liberating women, and now like everything is going to the shitter.
Well, I'm actually, I don't know if I'm right in this appreciation, but historically, women in Europe have had quite a bit of power domestically and socially. And that turns out to be pretty good, because it allows the men to go make money and migrate and conduct wars for profit. Nonsense, right? So our women have generally done pretty well. So I thought that was a good thing. But it turns out that giving them the vote was the real issue. If we hadn't given them the vote, none of this would have happened, because it's really the appeal to that demographic and their tendency, because they're a narrow distribution, to concentrate in this nonsense. That's really the problem. Then you add that women don't appear to develop morally until they have children, and you add the pill and then extend childbirth. The number of single women we have on top of the number of women who maintain natural state even once they have 2 or more children, you're getting a demographic that can shift it, and has been consistently shifting it all along. And you listen to their arguments, and it's insane. I mean, it means something to them, but what they think is, I want that. It's not that they think that's true and possible. They just think they're voting for what they want rather than what's good, and that's a problem. So, as much as I was raised in the generation of we're all equal, fucking boomers did their job on me too. So when I was raised in that generation, and my instinct is to treat women as equals, the evidence is I mean, I love women. I mean, everybody knows that. But we're in a position where we have to unlearn that false promise that we are cognitively and intuitionally and instinctually equal. Or what we have to do is change our education from education to indoctrination, because that's what they did. By the way, if you haven't seen, for the audience, if you haven't seen the video by my friend, the guy who wrote Postmodernism, Stephen Hicks, excuse me. If you haven't seen Stephen Hicks' video, how education became indoctrination on YouTube, you should watch it. But anyway, so the problem the institute has with this question is, we sound like we're misogynist. No, we're saying that people vote by instinctual methods in the absence of the knowledge to vote otherwise, and so that all of us are susceptible to some different kinds of suggestion. But it turns out that in the absence of a lot of rigorous social reinforcement, women's intuition is actually quite destructive in politics, and partly because they want to believe it. And it's an instinct. We can't blame that. It's like saying, well, men demonstrate more physical criminality than women. Of course, but women demonstrate more antisocial behavior than men. What? No, really. It's just that we ignore it. But when you give it the vote, it turns out to be as destructive if not more destructive than male violence, because male violence is at least confrontable and addressable. But the sedition by which women operate is a gradual means of incremental undermining that destroys the capital we can't replace.
Yes,
If men go to
exactly.
war, we can replace the capital we destroy by physical easily, but we can't replace the social, historical, intellectual knowledge and behavioral capital, especially institutional capital, that takes generations to form, and which we're trying to get the rest of the world to form so they can have the same level of prosperity. Of course, I'm waiting for Martin to chime in on this one. And we're optimistically trying to do this. Meanwhile, we're letting the women undermine our own. Anyway.
Well, I reject that female suffrage is the main issue. It's mostly a cover for what the real issue is, because what people, including women, vote for has very little to do with what actually happens politically.
I'm not sure that's true. I know what you're saying, and what you're saying is everybody's fighting for the same votes, so everybody migrates to the same position. I think that's correct. I think if you take women out of the equation, you end up with everybody migrating because the first past the post system, which is again another mistake we have in our Constitution. Because the first past the post system, everybody has to migrate toward the same position because the parties can't change, so their party affiliations change, like factions associate with different parties. So this naturally drives parties to the same position, rather than driving parties to experimentation with what actually works. So I want to say you are correct, but it's not a necessity. It's an unfortunate reality of the especially the American first past the post system.
That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying voting is just for a show to make people content that they have some influence, but they really don't. And politicians aren't there to satisfy the voters, but lobbyists and blackmailers and whoever.
It's certainly the case now because the system has deteriorated to this extent.
Well, we've always had this complaint, and it's always been true, and it's always been true everywhere. But to say that the population does not gradually move the government in a direction is certainly not true. I mean, it certainly is true. The population's interests do move it. And the real problem is democracy is parties benefit from selling free shit instead of selling responsibility that's costly. And that's the problem with democracy. So this is like one of those millions of things that you have. The reason I'll address that in one of our next questions. I'll address the how it's important to have both Martin and my perspective on these things.
One more thing about female suffrage. It implies that women are behaving like this spontaneously rather than they're organized from the top down.
Correct.
It's essentially giving a huge vote to the propagandizers.
Yes. Which your point was, we can solve if we take care of the propagandizers.
Yeah.
Okay, what's the next question?
All right, question 2 from Sam. I am a computer science undergraduate student at a decent university, top 50. Is this a wise path to take in the modern world?
Okay, I thought about this quite a bit before I answered it because I think it's a meaningful question for a lot of people. And so if anybody thinks they're going to give you the correct answer, they're wrong, because we actually don't know. However, I can give some pretty good advice on the question of whether it's a good career path. So first of all, AI is getting a lot better quite fast. And I know the Q-Star Strawberry, whatever they're calling it now, Orion or whatever, is the solution of, it's a recursive algorithm. It's wayfinding. They've gotten away from just the implicit wayfinding among sentences given concepts that are ordered in the sentence, the question asked. Right? There's a statistical model there which allows for hallucination into recursive. In other words, keep doing it over and over again, and breaking the problem into sections and using agents. In other words, they're getting closer and closer to the brain. So, but the problem with this is that AI, like most sciences, of which you got to understand, this is a very complex problem. It's the most complex problem we've encountered. It's probably more complex than biological evolution, in that biological evolution takes a lot of different things, and this takes a simple thing that has to do with lots of different things. In other words, that's the difference between the two categories of problem. So the problem with this, with all these forms of exploration, is that they follow a power law. And the power law is like, wow, you think of it as the 80-20 rule, is that you make this incredible progress, right, with the first 80%, right? And you think, wow, I'm so far along. But every incremental piece is 10 times as hard as the piece before it. And so it's not clear how fast this is going to go in any given direction. And my optimism side is the same with everybody else's who has the knowledge to comment, and I'm not sure there's enough of those, is that I'm not sure how long that takes to play out, when in the sense of providing us with an AI that can do what people can do.
Well, are you talking about an AGI or actually an AI that's, say, just specifically very good at turning your thoughts into code?
That one, the latter, right? Right. So I'm saying here's the thing: is it turning your thoughts into code? Have you tried it at all, Francis? Because
I have, and I have to say, is actually, well, I haven't tried some of the really recent ones that Moritz keeps on spitting out. But here's my experience so far, which is just based on what I play with it. The state of AI now, the ones I've seen, with enough work, they can replace the SDK. They can replace me going into the document, reading about the function prototypes and so on. In fact, like, this is nothing new. Like GitHub have done a version of this, and I forgot what they call it, the Copilot or something like that.
Exactly, Copilot.
That helps, that makes IntelliSense even better, and so on. Mm-hmm. The problem with AI right now is they lie with confidence. Yes. Like, the number of times I followed AI's advice and tried to do something in code, only to have it to be so blatantly wrong. And then when I confront the AI, I'm so frustrated because it's like it's telling me nonsense, and it's telling me nonsense.
It's error, right?
It doesn't know that it errors, even when I confront it.
And sometimes you can't convince it, right? And so that's the 80-20 problem. Is I think you've just that's a perfect example. What I found is that, like, sketch this for me, or I want a function that does this. I have to look less up, but I still have to think about the freaking logic of the thing, because if you look at the logic it puts together, it's fucking horrible. Now, will it get better over time? Sure, it will get better over time, but I think that the future is pretty obvious. The future looks pretty obvious. First, we have the power law problem. These things are for me, it's a really powerful search algorithm. Right. And that's what it does. And for my work, I use it all the time, every day, because that's how I use it. Right. How do I explain this particular thing? Or I don't want to, like you just brought up AI. But for example, there's like 30 some odd neurochemicals that guide your axon terminals to the right place in your brain. Right. I mean, this basically signals, sniffs its way there. Right. Do you think I remember all the 30 of those things? Right. I mean, I don't remember all 30. I remember like 4. Right. So when you use it for that, it's great. It's the same thing with APIs. I don't remember how to the fucking call this API, right? And decide the fact that how many of them can you really know? Like I don't remember. I've read the Rust documentation. I don't remember any of it, right? So, and so I think that's fine. I think you can use it to test your code. That'll be something that'll be interesting. That'll happen.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's us. But so I don't want to say. All I want to say there might be overplaying this point, but the point I'm trying to make is that it's got a long way to go before it's more than an improvement to the what do you call it, the code environment,
IDE.
the IDE. The next thing we want to think about is that we'll eventually get to where coding is the natural language. In other words, is no natural language. Now, I was trained to do that anyway. Of course, I'm old, but I was trained to write pseudocode, right? And the reason is that we had to write shit on paper, give it to some lady to key in, who would run and compile it overnight and give us the results the next day. I mean,
so by the time I learned this, I was already spoiled, because then I can just type into the compiler and let the compiler either pass or fail. And so I don't have to writing pseudocode anymore. And so when I was in college, it's like, what is this pseudocode shit? Like I can just type into VI and use GCC to compile. That was before the kids with the graphical interface IDEs.
You're right. And so then you go. I remember writing assembly language on a on a motor. I think it was a Motorola 6809. It's not a very powerful. It's like a 3 megahertz chip, right? I remember writing this, and you would write text, and then you would run the compiler on the text, right? And it would just do this over and over and over and over again, right? Well, that was an improvement from my perspective, right? I mean, that was great. And then we just went through this whole process. Well, we're sort of doing the same thing here. It's just that you're going to start writing more semantically. And I suspect that unlike what they're saying here, we're going to develop this language this natural language that we talk to computers with, that is more discrete than ordinary language, right?
You hit it right on the point. So I see AI programming, like programming AI and like AI write code, as just another layer of
abstraction.
No, but abstraction is right. But what do you call like languages like C, high level languages? I mean, we have assembly, we have machine code, right? We have assembly, and then we have high level languages like C and so on. But when you write in C and C++, it still doesn't sound like English. So you can now tell the AI, describe something and have it write the routine for you into something like C, or maybe just directly into assembly, right?
Well, that's where I was going.
Isn't better, but it requires you to think in a different way. You can't talk to the English, just like I can't write in English in C.
Brad's always teasing me today. The precision of the prompts I write when I'm asking a question is because I know what it's going to think if I don't ask the question precisely. So I think you jumped ahead to my third point, which was the end point is we're not going to have code at all, right? We're going to have an English language description, and it's going to go right of some sort. It's going to look like some sort of pseudocode thing. That's a hybridization of code in English, and it's going to go right to assembler. And eventually you will be talking to it, and it'll turn right into assembler. I actually prefer if it wasn't assembler. I prefer it was a tokenized language like what is it? Who said the other day? Who's the old guy who used to run Google?
Old guy?
Not the guy who used to run Google.
Eric Schmidt.
Eric Schmidt. He's saying the language that never should have succeeded. I hated that it succeeded, which is Python, right? But the great thing about Python, it does do this bytecode sort of thing that's generalizable to the platform.
Oh, I mean like an intermediate code.
Yes. So if it did that, I think that would be the best answer, right? Because once you go right to machine code, there's no, when you're trying to do anything cross-platform is fucking nightmare.
Right. I mean, the like cross-platform thing, that's been big in the last 20 years or so since nobody wants to be tied into a single OS and single platform or even single
Mhm.
architecture. When you have
Exactly.
this intermediate level code and compile to that intermediate level code, and then you just have compiler, one for ARM32, or I mean ARM64, one for x86, and so on.
Yep. So I want to make sure if I love the depth we can get into these, but given that direction and how long it's going to take, all right. So we just described an interesting problem that we're at the beginning of the power law curve, right? Um, like I used to say, I wrote the first legal AI. Well, it isn't true. I wrote the first legal expert system, right? But by today's standards, it's not an AI, right? It still has neural network components, but it had a lot of if-then statements in it too, right? So that was back in the 80s, right? And so, but if you look at the things today, they're developing really quickly because they've got enough computing power to vaguely imitate the brain. And I think that as Francis and I just described, we're going to get to where you're coding in natural language. I just have a very difficult time thinking that you're not going to be still thinking in some protocol, which you say an ultra high level language that's closer to
You
English,
have
more
to,
tolerant.
just like when you write code in this computer language like C and C++, which restricts you to certain syntax. With AI, here's my opinion, right? With AI, it may be able to liberate you from learning that English
Correct.
but not English.
Yes.
But it doesn't change the fact that you have to think in a certain way, a logical way, that does not introduce ambiguities. Because
Right.
if you introduce ambiguities and rely on AI to solve your problems for you, I think that will actually require AGI, which in my opinion, we're
Right.
very
Which
far
is,
from.
thank you for making that distinction. I believe it'll get there, but what I'm really saying is here's the can't remember if I had 4 points or 5. Here's the last point: is that we're already seeing people lose their jobs, right, in fairly large numbers, but they're the people that write crap, right? I mean, is it really code? Right? Is it really just scripting? What is that? I mean, think of all the people that went into data analysis that are going to be out of a job because they're going out first, right? That the creators are going out. In other words, the people who do artwork and whatever, they're going to go out. The data and analysis people will go out. The guys who make whatever code are going to go out. But in my experience, most of the time, all the work is not the business logic, right? It's not the logic you're trying to do. It's converting data between states and states, right? I mean, that's most of the work. I have to take data that's distributed and stored in these formats, put it through these massages, and present it to the user so that I can send it back to the thing and decompose it again and store it in whatever section. And I just think that problem is gonna go away. I mean, I don't know, you're probably not old enough to remember before ODBC, are you? Do you remember when we had to write the fucking DLLs to send stuff to SQL Server? It was a nightmare. I remember looking at the first ODBC code and thinking, you mean we're sending that much shit back and forth just to ask the SQL statement, right? But it turned out to be tremendously powerful method of doing so. So I expect that the way that data brokering problem had and the expansion of different data structures that we have, I expect a lot of that plumbing to be something that the computers get very good at. I expect that the use of that data to interact with users to not be very good. I mean, I just don't see that becoming, if I look at the stuff that people cared about, it's the psychology of the user, that the presenting the information that suits the psychology and knowledge of the user. Does that make sense? Right? So it's like, what is that? I used to have a bunch of rules. Don't make me remember anything. don't make me have to know anything. Don't make me have to remember anything. Remember that people don't read things things are based on spatial locations or on the page, right? Not reading text. Don't make me read anything. Don't make me know anything, and don't make me remember anything. You start playing with games like that. Now you've got to understand the reader, the user, and I think there's always going to be games that are going to go on between there, and so there's probably that. And there's always going to be business logic. But again, if you look at, for example, this came out along. This is old now, but back in the day, when you were putting in an MRP, right? Not MRP. What was I talking about? Research. When we put in the big SAP or something, right? You would say the reason we have it this way in SAP is because everybody who does it right does it this way. And if you're not doing it this way, it's not. We don't have to change SAP. We need to change your business process because it's too dependent on people and it's too inefficient. Right? I think that if I look at my application, my company's application, it's very much in that same vein. Is that why do we need all these apps and why do we need these apps across an operating system when fundamentally it's all the operating system's job now, right? So I think there are going to be those kind of changes that happen, and there's going to be a huge consolidation. In other words, vast consolidation of everything other than interfaces that are applicable to the context of the given user. So I expect that consolidation to happen. But if you're going to ask me, are they going to need programmers? We're going to need good ones, is what the guys
I
ask.
would make a distinction between
Go ahead.
programmer versus a design engineer.
Yes.
So
yes.
programmer, if you look at the terms of word, is someone who call a coding monkey, right? Someone who turns somebody's intention and just blindly turn it into code and make the code run and so on.
Yep.
AI can, with enough computational power, model training, and everything, we can get to a point where the AI can probably get 80% good or even 90% good at doing that. There's still going to be bugs. You probably still need to go in there and do some debugging and fix the bugs that the AI introduces and so on. It just requires, you still need to understand how computers think, how computers work based on the current computational paradigm. If neuromorphic chips comes in, then that's a totally new, different paradigm. Then we'll have another conversation by then. But the act of designing something for human use, which at the end of the day is what we do here,
Correct.
Right? We actually serve the human. That act doesn't go away.
What I was trying to say.
Whether you take whether it's somebody over there has a problem, and then you interface with them, tease out what problem they're trying to solve, and then you turn this into a set of requirements, a design, and so on, give it to an AI to go implement, or today that you give it to a set of an engineering team to implement. That design aspect never goes away until the day that we actually have an AGI who can figure out what I want before I do.
Yes, exactly. All right. So I want to make sure we answer this question, which is basically, am I making the right career investment? I think he said I'm in the top 50 or something like that. Or is,
Yes.
yeah, he's in the top university. I expect that if you're an engineer, yes. But if we had the same problem during the run up to 2001's crisis, right, collapse, was that there were people in the business that a lot of them that had no business being in the business. And we're going through that right now. We have a whole lot of people in the business. I don't know how you think about this, Francis, but if I look at just the problem of JavaScript, how many jobs are created by the fact that we have to use this horrible language as a text stream to the browser? If I think about just how many billions of dollars that costs, right, and on all the people employed in doing that, that makes me crazy.
Yeah, we both know people who went into the field because that's where the money at, but clearly they have no business of running the field. I was
Yeah.
a TA, a tutor, whatever you call it, for these computer science classes. And I remember tutoring people who can't put two pieces of code together to write a sorting function, somehow graduated with a CS degree. It's like, how the fuck did you do that?
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, all right. So let's, I think we've probably beat that one dead. So what's the next one?
Question 3 from Daniel. Can you provide an operational definition for moral license? How is moral license created and how is it used? What is its value? Is there a series that it belongs to? And how does it relate to rights? Can I have a right without moral license or moral license without a right? Can you also relate it to the idea of entitlement? And can you relate this to the idea of rights endowed by our Creator, among them of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? Are there rights and or moral license endowed by our Creator, or are they entirely okay?
So I just want to get, before Martin answers this question, because he's doing, is that, is this our Daniel? Which Dan, is this our Daniel, like
I'm
the
guessing it
library
is.
Daniel?
I don't know
Martin,
whether
you know
it's
who
the Daniel.
We
I'm
have
guessing
no
it
way
is.
of telling.
Huh?
We have no way of telling other than asking him.
All right, I was just wondering, because it's a hard question.
I think Daniel cheated. Like, we're supposed to have like one question at a time, and he just compounded a whole bunch of questions.
I was going to say, I mean, could you ask a hard enough question?
I just realized I didn't answer it fully. But anyway, moral license is a license to maintain self-image as a moral person, even after performing a specific act, and ideally a belief that others will agree with that image.
Okay, that's profound. He's actually said the thing right this time, you know, that you hear from people all the time, but he's actually stated operationally what it means, which I think is brilliant.
Providing it to people might thus let them do things they wouldn't do otherwise. Rights and the rule of law would correspond to what is moral, and so one would need to fear doing something immoral, doing something immoral yet legal, or moral yet illegal. This is, of course, not the case under this regime. We can sympathize with what the founders were trying to accomplish with that phrasing, and it corresponds to how English gentry felt about their liberty, and it worked while these remained in control of their country, which is to say, less than a century. Otherwise, no, none of it is literally true.
Okay, let me see if I can get this. This is all right. Yes, this is absolutely correct. So Martin, can we tease out your last sentence here?
Sure.
None of it is literally true. Well, let's start before that. We can sympathize with what the founders were trying to accomplish with their phrasing, and it corresponds, Martin's right, to how the English gentry felt about their liberty. I think it's also their responsibility to the people, because they did have some. And it worked while these remained in control of their country, which is to say, less than a century. Otherwise, no, none of it is literally true. Are you taking the extreme position when you say none of it's true? Are you saying that in all practical senses, it turns out that while there's some basis to it, it does not, in the end, it no longer functions?
I'm saying if you were to describe truthfully what they were trying to do, it would be a very different descriptions from
what actually is.
Put it, yeah.
Okay.
Not magical thinking.
Correct. It was a very optimistic, right, statement of the time and place. And if we look at the optimism of Jefferson, who used to be my take on things, and the pessimism of Hamilton, which is the other side, turns out Hamilton was right. Right? I mean, that's basically the argument. So I just want to go through these questions. you can't do, I'm going to copy Martin's thing, Martin's first sentence out there and put it out because that's exactly what moral license means. The man just came home. His Highness Lord President of the Institute just came home. Is there a series that it belongs to, and how does this relate to rights? Well, there's what Martin is saying is that a moral license should be a completely social phenomenon, and that in other words, it should be something that not only you feel is right, but others feel is right also, right? In other words, not harmful. A right is a contractual codification of that in some sort of statute, right? So something can be good or virtuous and not harmful. And then for it to be a right, that means you have an insurer of last resort, that will ensure that as a contract right rather than a normative right. So how does that relate to rights? Those, as Martin said, they should be equal. When you ask the next question, which is, how can you also relate the idea of an entitlement? Now, what they're saying, this is the real problem, right? The creeping context of rights. A right is a thing that we can exchange because it's possible to exchange. In other words, both parties can do it. That's great. So we have a moral license, we have a contractual or legislative right, and we have what we would call an entitlement or a privilege. A privilege is something we agree to grant one another, regardless of whether it's actually moral or not. And so some certain things, do you have a right to insurance by others? Of what? Sure, of your life, liberty, and property. But do you have a right to insurance of your misjudgments, your bad judgments, your bad decisions? Well, that would be a privilege. It can't be a right. It can be a contractual It can be given the equivalent of a right, but it's not a right. It's a privilege. And then, can you relate this to ideas of endowed by a creator, among them life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness? Well, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, that's just what we call a self-determination by self-determined means. And so but what is self-determination by self-determined means? It means nobody's imposing a harm against your ability to be self-determined by self-determined means. Well, if you would say, how do you put it about God's law? Endowed by our creator, is that whether you believe God is an actor or a metaphor, the rules of the universe are the same, and the natural law, which is people will not retaliate against you for your actions if you permit them sovereignty and self-determination by self-determined means, requiring sovereignty and demonstrated interest and reciprocity and display word and deed. So I would say the natural law, as we discover, is that thing that is endowed by our creator, whether that's the natural process of the universe or the deliberate intention of some being or other, that we develop a moral law experimentally that reflects it, that hopefully that we encode that in constitutions as rights, obligations, and alienations. And if we have the luxury of granting each other privileges, in other words, basically redistributions, that's fine. But what people are trying to do now is they're trying to force privileges instead of rights, instead of moral rights and obligations that are necessary for the fulfillment of this right for people to be self-determined by self-determined means. In other words, they're enacting crimes of parasitism, or it's organized crime, but that's what they're doing. And they assume, I mean, there's one thing we'll say, well, it's just better to take care of each other, but is it better to allow, millions and millions and millions of immigrants in here who are way more costly per capita than natives? I mean, there's a beautiful graphic that got shared out of The Economist. I think it was Economist yesterday, which was, I can't remember, is this the right or the left on your screen?
Left.
This is the left on mine.
This is the left on your screen? Okay, so what happens is that the curve for Europeans is like the Northern Europeans is like this. In other words,
What's the
contribution-
x-axis and y-axis?
This is the lifespan,
Uh-huh.
and this is the Curt contribution to income, revenue, GDP,
Okay.
and tax.
Okay.
All right. And so this is your lifeline. So there's a big curve for Europeans, right? There's a slightly smaller curve for other Europeans, which basically means Southern Europeans, right? But if you look at the curve for non-Europeans, it's way down here, less than a third. And if you look at it for Africans, it's way down at the bottom as a little level line. So the real problem is that the only net contributors to taxation are basically, I mean, we say it's white males over 35, but it's white, Asian, Jewish. It's the productive classes over everybody else. And women almost never pay for themselves. And we're just paying for vast numbers of people. And we're planning on a future that is dependent upon immigration of people who are 1/3 as productive as our populations.
I think it's again the extension of the false belief that everyone is equal. So let's just look at the numbers and not the qualitative effect of the individuals that you bring in. Right? When economists when they look at productivity and GDP and so on, well, it's productivity times number of people, assuming all those people are all the same.
Right, and I look at things that offend people like IQ, which I say this all the time. I keep this enormous spreadsheet of everything, right? And it's just, if you want to know any measure relative to anybody else, it's just IQ. And so if you bring in people that are in the 90s or 80s, you're hurting yourself long term, because that's a multiplier. If you bring in people that are over 125, you're helping yourself. It's a multiplier. The problem is those people don't breed enough in modernity. And anyway, so how did we get here? What were we trying to answer? Rights, obligations, whatever. So you've answered the question. The real problem is that people are unequal. And I would say that people are unequal in their ability to bear responsibility for self, private, and common, because they're unequal in cognitive knowledge, physical cognitive and knowledge and experiential capital. And most of it has to do with the ability to self-regulate, so you can delay your time preference enough to produce enough capital to offset your costs. So, I mean, the real issue again is, Martin got asked a really smart question. I don't know if it's in this list, but how much of it's the European tradition of needing to bring people up, right? The slave, serf, freeman, citizen, sovereign hierarchy, in other words, which is a responsibility hierarchy, and how much of it's Christianity trying to teach each other to be equal, and how much of it is the rise of the upper middle class and middle class during the Enlightenment, claiming we're all equal, in order to say, well, it's not that we're all equal; it's that the aristocracy isn't more equal than the rest, right? More isn't superior to the rest, which turns out to be weirdly untrue also. So we're stuck in this problem of that, plus the use that false equality that's been riding with us forever, combined with the fact that if you look at people's demonstrated voting behavior, they're actually voting their capacity to bear responsibility and accountability. And that's all that's going on. And it's not good, because not enough people today are able to do it. We were mostly farmers. A farmer's basically got to be a businessman in order to hold property and the resources necessary to produce cyclical incomes. but you have a whole bunch of people. I mean, why does the government, anybody who works for any government, get to vote? That's insane. I did this beautiful chart back in the 90s that showed how many people were actually in the market versus how many people that were outside of the market. And if you look at education, as our whole purpose of education is to exit you from the market pressure.
Wait, say again?
It's an exaggeration to make a point. The whole purpose of education is to avoid work and get you out of market pressures, right?
Well, I mean, these days, sure.
Yes, and so the problem becomes one of, this is just a compounding error over time that unfortunately women, when we added women, their primary difference between the sexes is what they're responsible for. Men will take responsibility for private and common. Women won't take responsibility for much other than themselves and their offspring, or any close relative they personally know, something within experiential range, but they'll make other people happily responsible for it. Now, this makes sense evolutionarily, and I don't try to use evolutionary psychology very often, but it is true that women were treated as property throughout most of history. And so the women had to treat relations with men in any given tribe as a pragmatism, and so the women had to adapt to whatever male structure that was available to them, and they had to adapt to whatever females were dominant in that structure already. So because they're relatively fragile and their children are fragile. So that makes the evolutionary history of it makes perfect sense. The problem is we're not in that situation anymore, and women keep voting for the enemy because they don't want to be responsible for otherwise.
I think we started deviating on this a little bit, and while this conversation is going on, I kept on thinking, what comes first, the moral license or a commonly agreed law, i.e. common law? So is moral license just a non-codified, like, proto-form of common law?
Correct. I mean, law is not, it's not an ancestral invention. It's an invention of cities.
Mm-hmm.
Before that, you have custom, right? So customs develop, and customs are useful in that there's a historical means, but they're adaptable within a small group who can basically agree to manipulate. But once you get big, then now you got to codify this stuff because you need to force people to adhere to a standard of weight and measure so they don't get into conflict all the time. And also because it's just a means of ensuring people against abuses by people who are more cunning and would take advantage of them. But it was you go from custom, which is the band and tribe
Mm-hmm.
method, right? Until you get to cities where you have contracts, which is where you get laws. And so your discussion or your question of what's the evolutionary path is, and it's hard to discuss norm without the same context, right? So what's a norm? Well, a norm within your tribe? Does that really make sense, or is that just what we get away with?
What you just said makes sense, but where does norm come in?
My understanding of the development of norm is when we get to law and we distinguish between norm, tradition, and law. In other words, you start to have a different system of measurement because of how it's reinforced. So a tradition is quite soft, right? You just do things this way, and that, right? You have a norm, which is, in other words, you do things at the tradition level because it's a big thing like festivals and rituals and whatever, and it's a general social bonding experience. A norm is a thing that you do to demonstrate that you're a reasonable market participant to others. In other words, that you're trustworthy. So tradition means I'm part of the group. A norm means you're trustworthy.
Mm-hmm.
And a law is a thing because people break the trustworthy thing. Does that make sense? So you have this spectrum evolve, and you don't need these things when all you've got is custom,
Mm-hmm.
right? When you've got custom, that's everything. We just do it this way, so that this is how we do it. And it's why you find these places where the whole village builds every hut, right? This is my favorite example. The whole village builds every hut. Well, it means that you get to live in that hut, but the hut belongs to the village, right? It's not yours to dispose of, right? If you want to have somebody else live there, that's a village decision because it's the village asset. So you get things like that. Once you get property, right, you get real property like farmland and whatever, then all of a sudden property becomes more atomic over time because you need more flexibility in the use of it and more responsibility over it. And because of that, you have that because you have more productivity because of it. So you get the custom, norm, law difference, and really constitutions are the next step because they formalize not only what you can do to each other, but your relationship with the government, right? So you eventually get this, you're basically increasing the populations and the precision of how to cooperate as populations and division of labor increase.
Yeah, different. I think these tools for operating at different scales of human
Correct.
network with
Well,
different
think of it
levels
as
of
you used to have go ahead.
with different levels of enforcement.
Right. So you used to have your reputation, right? Your reputation was a big deal. Very, very big deal, much more so than people imagine. And then we got to church records, which is fascinating. Then we got to criminal records. Then we got to credit records. And now I'm kind of worried about social, what do you call it? Social
credit.
Social credit. I'm really worried about that. I'm not so keen even on credit rating because people when they screw up, they need the chance to restart. The same thing with criminal records. I mean, if you smoke pot when you were 20, there's
always going to be a phase. Everybody should experiment at some point.
Right. And so there's just, we all do stupid shit, right? And so, but if you're like, you're a serial offender, those people need to be gone. Right. I mean, because we're seeing this happen around the world. Anyway, I don't want to belabor this because we spent a lot of time on it already.
We still have the third part of his question that we haven't answered. Can you relate this to the idea of rights endowed by our Creator, among them life, liberty, pursuit, happiness? Are there rights and or moral licenses endowed by Creator, so to speak, or are they entirely social constructs, or none?
There are science that we discover through trial and error, like everything else. And if you say, so are they endowed by the Creator? I thought I answered that, which is that it doesn't matter if the Creator's agentic or it's just a natural process of the evolutionary the universe. Natural law is just natural law. In other words, it's what people need. It's the system of measurement which says, I will cooperate and not conflict if we do these things, if we limit our behavior to these things, which is the mutual assurance of self-determination by self-determined means through sovereignty and demonstrated interest and reciprocity in display, word, and deed. That's natural law, right? But that's what we did.
You actually just something just dawned on me. Endowed by our Creator was simply the founding fathers' way of saying they lacked the language to describe natural law.
Well, they actually weren't sure how to say it, but it was the proper language of the day. But as you know, most of our founders were deists. Right, which I would actually consider myself a deist, right? I mean, I don't know where these laws come from. I don't need to understand. I don't know if there's a real God, whatever, or man-made. I don't know. The laws are the same either way. I don't need to know that. Right. And so we discovered the laws correctly, and it turns out that around the world, everything approaches the natural law. I mean, we gradually around the world, humans discover this general path toward it. And they are limited by political structures and power structures and whatever from approaching it. But everybody seems to migrate toward this general direction, so much so that international law is basically natural law. Just don't do anything. The natural law is international law is basically don't do shit that makes people pissed off. I mean, really, it's that simple.
Yeah, except is it really law?
It's
I guess
not
I can't
law.
really you can't really treat it as legislation because nobody is there to enforce it. Like, is UN gonna enforce it? No.
Well, the problem is people will enforce it. In other words, they will enforce it by military means.
Well, yeah, but like when you say people, so again, what I'm saying, there's really no supranational authority
No.
to enforce these laws. That ultimately, like when they
But
say,
then
"Oh,
even-
some
even
people
with
will enforce it,"
people-
they're going to be looking at the United States military. But then
Of course.
that's a agent with its own what do you call it, partiality. It's not the impartial enforcement.
No, it isn't, and people will always try to skate it, right? But that doesn't change. It doesn't. So I'm trying to tease something out of you right now for the audience, which is when you say law, what do you mean? Right? We have laws of the universe.
Mm-hmm.
They aren't really violable.
Right.
We have natural law of cooperation. It's violable. We violate
It's
it.
violated. So here's where I think.
Hold on, let me finish.
Okay.
If you try to violate a law of the universe, right, a physical law, something bad will happen to
Yes.
you. If you try to violate the natural law of cooperation, things will generally bad happen to you,
Mm-hmm.
right? Right. If you violate a statute law, bad things will probably happen to you. Heck, go back and say, if you violate a normative law, bad things will happen to you, right? And so what does a law mean? It means this is a general rule that we want to go by because bad things will happen to you if you don't.
But
Now,
where it differs.
well, hold on, and that's different from legislation,
Sure.
right? And which is different from command, right? And so you have a law of nature at this side and a command at the other. This one we can't avoid, right? And this over here, well, it's completely arbitrary. But this is completely fixed, and this is completely arbitrary. So we have this spectrum in between.
But the point I'm trying to make is the enforcement mechanism in the spectrum varies tremendously.
Correct. Yes.
If you
exactly.
violate the law of nature, I know of no ways to escape that because the universe enforces it on you.
Yes.
If you violate the law of human cooperation, which is also approaching natural law, this quote force of nature, or this entity known as mankind, eventually enforce it on you. But it's
Yes.
not like gravity, right? Because
No.
our agency is limited.
Okay,
If
so
you
that's a
violate,
brilliant question.
if you
I'd say just that's that analogy. If you
Mm.
can use an analogy with the law of gravity, but you can expend energy to stay up in the air, as airplanes indeed do. And you can expend energy to stay away from consequences of being a piece of shit, you know.
It's a cost.
yes,
So it's a cost issue. So what I was going to get to is we shouldn't distinguish ourselves from any other act of. I mean, what does ternary logic mean? It's all the same, right? So we shouldn't. What you correctly described is the difference between our predictive capacity, therefore our ability to choose, and the consequences of it. So we can keep trying to outwit the laws of nature. We can outwit the natural law of cooperation. We can do lots of things, but where there's a cost, there's an opportunity for doing so. Like raiding is quite profitable, right? But there's a cost of it, which is eventually people kill the raiders. So it's just a cost issue. So you're always making a trade-off. When we emphasize the natural law, what we're saying is this is a system of decidability that provides a baseline for measurement, just like gravity provides a baseline for measurement, right? The speed of light provides a baseline for measurement. If you want to deviate from it, fine. You want to deviate from gravity, you might fall and kill yourself. You might figure out how to fly an airplane, right? If you want to deviate from the natural law, you might be able to do that for some period of time, but you'll be paying a cost for it. What it looks like people do is they gradually, incrementally seek privileges to avoid it until the system has absorbed all the free capital and there's no energy left, in other words, no capital left, no energy left to alter course. And that's when civilizations, states, nations break down.
Mm.
And so the question is, when are you paying the price? Well, the price of gravity is relatively immediate. The price of temperature violation is extremely immediate. Right? But the price of violation from natural law, it could be delayed for a generation or 2 or 3 or 5, but you'll eventually pay for it.
And what's most insidious about these type of encroachments is because these are hidden capital, we can't really see and touch it. It actually requires a certain level of abstract thinking to be able even to perceive that level of capital. So
Right,
stealing from that capital is so, that's why stealing from that capital is so insidious.
Yes. So this is why I always say, Martin will say this all the time, full accounting, right? And then we have to measure all capital. Mm-hmm. What we do today with this GDP measure, it's crap, right? It's absolute crap. If you look at bowling alone, the loss of social and institutional capital, it's devastatingly expensive, because you got to think about it. What would it take to recreate it? Probably a war and a revolution to recreate it. So that would be the cost. That would how you estimate the cost of the mistake we've made, plus all the lives that have been affected by it. So it's a really, really high cost value when you deviate from, when you pretend the laws of nature don't work. Now, we talk about the natural law of cooperation, but it's just one of the laws, right? You have the physical laws, the cooperative laws, and the evolutionary laws. What we're really trying to do right now is pretend evolutionary laws don't exist on one end and pretend physical laws, namely scarcity, doesn't exist on the other. And, that's just hyperconsumption.
Wait, how society pretending that law of evolution doesn't exist?
We're not maintaining what we would call natural selection, or we're not treating human capital as variable. And then the flip side is we're not managing. We're still under the illusion of infinite growth, which is the Marxist to progressive false promise.
Mm-hmm.
We're saying that there's no scarcity, which there obviously is, and you never escape it. And the second one is that they're pretending that there's no the laws of human behavior, which are just an extension of the laws of the physics, are not persistent.
The last 200 years since Industrial Revolution, in the grand scheme of things, when you look at history, it's just a drop in the bucket. It's like 1 second in the scale. But in that second, in the historical scale, we went for, I forgot the exact figure, but we could probably easily 10x the amount of energy captured by humans. So in the short term, we look at it, it seems like that's infinite growth because your curve went from like this to that.
Yes.
But we know that's not sustainable.
That's right. That growth isn't sustainable. What did you just touch on there that was that's very smart? The basic math is that if you want to look at the physics of being human, the algorithm is just energy consumption and conversion per capita. It's the same thing in IQ versus, you see the same thing. I mean, the only weird one's China because it's behind. But if you look at electricity, energy consumption, it's the same thing as IQ per capita. I'm about to lose my battery, so I'm going to run to the other room and grab my charger for a second.
So you already addressed a lot of the things I was going to respond to, but I'm not so much concerned with rights, privileges, entitlements. It's all names for property norms, and those are always going to be some sort of compromise. You just have to look at whether that compromise works and how it's changes the society over the long run, and which group it actually serves. Because I'd say the state should explicitly serve interests of some group, because it's gonna do so regardless, just not explicitly.
So, Curt, if you can still hear me,
I can hear you.
I was thinking about the answer to your question about China. So to use maybe not so apt analogy, if you think of IQ as vertical scaling, right? How powerful is your single computation node? Yes, China does have an advantage. But then when you look at the overall computational power of the entire mesh, it's often determined by the network policies and protocols. So in this case, I think China has a rather backward protocol. And of course, Marxism didn't do it any favors.
Well, I mean, I don't, of course, the way I look at it is, unfortunately, we got the current president or whatever he is, but they were going the right direction. And if for some reason this guy's position on is just, they were, I mean, so I look at China as a huge success story over the past 20, 30 years. But yes, I acknowledge it.
It's what I think is Francis Fukuyama calls a bad emperor problem. And
yes,
I would take even a level higher in that there's something in the Chinese psyche. Maybe it's a fact that state was his first institution, and maybe it's geopolitics that enables it to be trapped in this bad emperor problem. And just the history repeats. So it's not only because of this one guy for the last 10 years or so, which by some account, like there seems to be some kind of soft coup going on or whatever. But even if it was not him, inevitably some other bad emperor is going to rise that will undo the work of all the previous good emperors, which to me means that there's something wrong with the base code, something wrong with the protocol of cooperation or something.
Isn't it still, I mean, the princeling thing, isn't that still feudal?
Yeah, I mean, it's a society ruled by bureaucratic elites, right? It's been that way since
forever,
2,500 years ago.
Yeah, exactly.
Anyways, I think we've beaten this one to death.
Yep. Okay, let's move on.
All right. Question 4 from Turd. I don't want to say that. Okay. Should NLI ultimately make its way into laws that outlaw feminine methods of warfare on a global scale? Where does this leave the diaspora in terms of geography, since there is no 110th country left? I'm not sure what this last part is referring to.
I don't understand the question. The 109 is a meme number for countries they have been expelled from. So what does no 110th country left mean? Regardless, they have their own. They can and should be all permanently moved there, as was even Balfour's intention. An agricultural and economic connection cut off with harsh punishment for anyone trying to restore them. Yeah, should have also addressed there's nothing going to be enforced on global scale unless every country decides for itself to do it. We have no interest in globalism.
I think that they should have taken the Madagascar deal.
Well, I talked to some Israelis when Gabriel was here, and they agreed. They have preferred the environment.
I don't have any comments to make here other than Martin's usually right, and this is another example. I don't think I can add anything that's valuable. Yeah, because anything we say is just adding more fuel to the controversy. What's next?
All right. Question 5. That's a long one. Honestly, I know Curt randomly while watching Gonzalo Lira on YouTube. He is my favorite man for red pill knowledge who was jailed in Ukraine and died later for telling the truth that Russia will win this conflict. Of course, I know from Curt's view, Russia will be the enemy of Europe as well as France and Russia will face severe consequences after all, but I don't understand that why European who being betrayed by its ally, the USA who destroys Nord Stream 2, keep being dependent upon and accept the fact that the globalists in the end will wipe out the white population by Islamic immigration army. Once Islam is 51% in Europe, I think it's over. Sorry for being black pill, but things just get worse, and as I understand, Darwinism and a bit of natural law thanks to reading Curt's work, I know that multiculturalism will always fail in a libertarian or what so-called democratic society, especially in Europe and USA, where the iron law of the earth, human are not equal and race IQ is real, white and some East Asian will outperform the rest, but being parasites on, parasited on, there will be no solution, right? Or unless a new Hitler arrives for World War III.
Well, this is all over the place.
Yeah, I'm not sure if this question.
Nothing is over, and the problem is getting our people into power. Solutions afterwards are easy. Millions of migrants can easily be kicked out with political will.
Yeah, Marty's, the enemy takes the position it's all about power. And we think we sort of tend to think it. Martin's always correct about this, and we tend to think about this as
the enemy is right, but the question is what you do with that power.
Correct. You need the power to change it. Otherwise, it's not a hard problem. I have a couple of things. First of all, I used to be pretty good friends with Lira. Chat. We used to talk a lot about economics, investments, living in Ukraine, what business investments to make over there, how we both had met Ukrainian women, etc. And he flipped on me and became very hostile for reasons I guess I understand. But I did not know him to be a good person, if you know what I mean. So when he died later, he died because he worked against the local population in a time of war, number one. And second, after multiple warnings and being given the right to go home if you wore basically a bracelet. And so, I mean, I wouldn't go to Ukraine and advocate for Russia when they're at war. I wouldn't do that to any country because I realize I'm a guest there. So he kept going after it, and he got what you'd expect. Now, as why he died, he was not healthy in the first place. And if you have a Turkish prison is sort of legendary in the West because of some movies we've had, but you don't want to be in a Ukrainian prison. It's freaking horrible. And especially if you're thought of as the enemy and that you can be beaten up and you can't bribe anyone and you're trying to pay people off. So basically he got the SHIT kicked out of him on a regular basis in there. And then when he got sick, they wouldn't give him any health care and he died from that. So I just view him as an example of what happens when you start to get too indoctrinated into your own fantasy, and it becomes a bit of folly on your part, and that you're trying to, especially if you're trying to choose clicks and attention over your survival. The second thing is that we know who blew up the pipeline, and I don't know why the right is so desperate to try to preserve this, but Russia blew up its pipeline. There's 28 hours of surveillance by, I think, the Swedes on this. They were right over the spot. The seismic relations are there and everything. So, and we know why they did it. It wasn't. It's counterintuitive, but there still are commercial relations between Europe and Russia, and there is still some gas going back and forth. And there were legal costs in Russia versus Europe if they if they kept the pipeline shut down or there was anything happening to the pipeline. By blowing it up, they got out of that legal contract. You might think that's nonsense because, of course, you can't envision the layers of complexity that the world operates by. In other words, economics are still real if countries are in political conflict or if in military conflict. So we know who did that. What's the next one? I think France is working itself out of the position. It looks like Sweden, Germany, and France are going to form a sort of new coalition in Europe. I would like it if they would bring in the Poles, or if Poles would take care of the Slavic people in general as the core state of the intermarium. I wish that would happen, but I think France is working its way out of its hole. The problem is the French ego is unbelievable, but they seem to be working their way out of the hole. As for the rest of it, Martin is, of course, as always, right. I think that we have kicked Islam out of Europe before, and I suspect we will do it again. We are simply in that phase where the current generation of people is invested enough, and the collapse is happening slowly enough, especially in Germany, that they're still desperate to pretend there's an answer, and there isn't. They're going to be kicked out again. And I suspect that will coincide roughly, because that appears to be what's happening, with the death of the World War II generation and the increase in the more recent generation. In other words, there's a timing here, because there's an association between kicking people out and the Holocaust, whatever, regardless of how much that Holocaust narrative is real versus fictional. And I think that Germany needs to overcome her anxiety, restate her position as a core state of Europe, and despite the fact that there's no way they can maintain their current economic and strategic position given their rates of reproduction, France will, Germany will, and Sweden will eventually form a coalition that will have to make this happen. Because I don't know if you've noticed yet, you are starting to hear France talk like Swedes. And so it's just a process. Remember, conservatives, we think in time, we can't help it. We think in consequence, and because we're the white cells of our civilizations. So we're correct on seeing stuff in the on the horizon, but we have to also remember that that's our job, is to detect those things, and we're right a lot. But that the population has to be willing to pay the cost of circumventing those things, and they're slow. So it's just what it is. Why you want conservatives in power in international affairs in particular is precisely this reason. Why you might want to have the priestly classes, which is the progressives in power, is in matters of the church, so to speak. And unfortunately, one of the things that I've come to conclusion of is that, as much as I have liked to pick on the corruption of the church in European history, it appears that keeping the church as a separate house was, in fact, one of the secrets to European success. And because you had a masculine house of the aristocracy that could deal with truth, international affairs, and you had a feminine house of the church that would keep care of the population. And the attempt to blend them, as well as the attempt to take our parliaments and collapse them, those have been mistakes. We needed to maintain the division of those institutional responsibilities.
Maybe this is a bit of a segue, but then we also have ascendant male, right? So
yeah,
was that represented by the guilds?
Look, ascendant male is, well, I mean, the problem, we don't have that happening until you can't really do it. I would say sort of, but the guilds are more like labor unions. The ascendant male isn't really possible in the sense we mean it until the Enlightenment comes around and you get the mobility of the middle class. You know, this is probably wrong. That's probably the wrong way. You get it in England because it was possible people to migrate for work, right? So that's one of the reasons labor could happen, the Industrial Revolution could happen in England, because people had already kept their household with their wives and their children, and they would migrate in certain seasons and do labor, like mostly construction related or farm related work, and then come back. So they already had this utility of a nuclear, absolute nuclear family and a mobile workforce. And so this was ready. This made it the industrial revolution much easier. So I forgot your question. Sorry.
Are the guilds essentially
Oh,
represented the
so
third leg of the
your
stool?
question is when does the ascendant male become possible? The ascendant male is always the desire of the young man to go out and learn about the world, right? And find opportunities in it, whether it just be a wife, whether it be a job, whether it be whatever, that's great. But the ascendant male as a political institution isn't really possible until the rise of the middle class. That's why libertarianism and the founders and all those other crap come about, is because they're able to create enough commercial opportunity independent of these institutions. Because remember, you just had the nobility in the church. That was it, right? The guilds were same, but they were basically local labor unions that tried to maintain some monopoly on production by the use of the favoritism of the state, by the monarchies or the princedoms. And so they would say, you have exclusive right to make barrels or whatever, right? Or this kind of basket or whatever. And that way they keep the competitors out of the market. And that way they can have a market that's healthy, that takes care of their locals. So this public-private partnership is eternal, right? It's not like it's a new thing. That's why I'm such a fan of the Silicon Valley of investment. It's much more closer to how the monarchies function. So anyway, so how did your question say? So
I guess that there. Sorry to interrupt you, but I guess there's a higher order bit I forgot to mention. So I was listening to one of Roger's video, I forgot which one, where he mentioned that one of the reasons why, in his mind, that Western society was able to advance so quickly is because relatively equal distribution of power among the trifunctional.
right,
You have the aristocracy.
Partly for me, I mean, that's Dumazel.
Yes, but then if the ascendant male wasn't really a political force until recently, then how does that explain the relatively rapid rise?
This is a great observation. So we know the masculine state and the feminine faith, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right? And what you're saying is, where does this libertarian
right
come from? Well, in our ancient history, what do you think warriors are? They're the independent warriors are the guys, right? And so who is their representative is the judge. Because it's a contractual civilization, right? You can't have authority in Western Civ because everybody's armed. There's no way to concentrate capital like there was in the Middle East or China because they're not riverbanks.
Mm-hmm.
So you got these warriors families that became the aristocracy, but how much that's their aristocracy is moderated by the judges. So you maintain trifunctionalism. You have the faith or the tradition, and that's for Christianity. Then you have the state, which is the king or the ruler or whatever. It's basically a general. And then you have the warriors who are able to be warriors because their families are productive enough to pay for horses, chariots, bronze, armor, this other shit. So it takes a whole clan to outfit one of these guys. And so they all maintain that it's just like entrepreneurs do. So what's happened is, I guess we forget that, or it isn't intuitive, that legalism and contractualism and commercialism are the same thing.
Are they
In other words, the basis.
the same thing?
What?
How are they the same thing?
Because they depend on contract. They don't depend on social approval and ostracization.
Yes.
And they don't pay on authority.
Right.
Authority. I said the dirty word with Martin in the room. Oh my God, I'll pay for that for the next hour.
They don't depend on state coercion.
Correct. Because nobody can coerce them. You can't finance a state. That's why this whole entrepreneurial system exists that turns into the Greeks and the Romans and whatever. And it turns out it's the most adaptive civilization precisely because the state cannot become an impediment.
And because you have these three legs of the stool, so to speak,
Correct.
So
Yeah.
all three-legged can cover a greater computation surface than, say, in China's case, you just basically you have a state that's way strong and way longer than any of the other levers.
Yes, correct. And so the problem is, if what is the rate of the three points of the triangle?
Mm-hmm.
The feminine faith, which is tradition, the martial state, right, or the bureaucratic or martial state, and the entrepreneurial contractualist. What's the velocity of adaptation possible by each of these? Well, you can't change tradition very easily. The great thing about a state is it can move large things quickly,
Mm-hmm.
whatever, but it also has the drag possible. But this thing moves continuous innovation, adaptation,
Yes.
and change. And so your civilization is dependent upon which institution is primary. So if you get the Middle East or India, you get great things and bad things. You get East Asia, which gets the masters. It basically invents the state,
Mm-hmm.
as we understand it, as other than a power structure. You guess you could go to the theological state in Egypt is probably the right example, but when we think of the intellectual state, that's really China, right? And the problem is you get this ability to do vast things because you can organize vast amounts of capital.
Mm-hmm.
And you have the rivers in China, which allow you to transport these vast armies and whatever. And you have this freaking territorial defense that's pretty amazing. And be a wonderful land to go outside with it. So you have all this going for you. But the problem is, of course, that power of the state and the bureaucratic state become an edifice that's almost impossible to
Correct.
change. And so because of that, you generate demand for emperors who can direct it to do it, which if you do, you generate the opportunity for bad emperors.
Yeah. And that explained why, even though China was at the cusp of industrial revolution and developing capitalism back in the 1200s, it was never able to take off, because when you have a state that's already so powerful,
That's right.
when these people are in power, they don't want anybody else to disrupt them.
That's right.
And so they can use their coercive power to in a sense of speaking, kick down the newcomers,
That's right.
those who wants to experiment.
And states in Europe, even if France was a pretty powerful state they were never able to do, you needed the nobility.
Mm-hmm.
The same way the Greeks needed, or the Romans, you had to have the nobility on your side. There's always this fucking power structure. And because our traditional law is like, no, our tradition says this, you as a king only have these rights. You eventually get multiple wars over that, which of course lead to Magna Carta and whatever, and the expansion of that over time. The reason you get the French Revolution is because the same problem has happened in China, is that the state was pretty strong. It was able to get strong enough for a while, still needed and still had to compete with the nobility, but they had so much. The state became so corrupt. The Parisian state became so corrupt that it took the revolution to stop it.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, the stupid thing they did is they kicked out their Protestants, which was the really dumb thing, which was their middle class. And they haven't recovered. They haven't recovered from the French Revolution. And despite their arrogance, it's just kind of weird. But anyway, all right. So do we kill that one? Is that
Yep. Do we have time for one more?
Well, I just want to dissociate ascendant males from libertarians.
Yes.
In a functional regime, there'd be plenty of opportunities for males to ascend via existing institutions for the service of the population. And there are rare libertarians that see when state is getting in the way of that, but usually it's just traitors who don't want to serve the population.
Yes. You're right, as always. I'd like to actually quickly go through the next two questions, because if I could, that'd be all right.
Yeah.
Go to the first one.
So from Anonymous, I'm glad the pamphlet is nearly complete. After the publication of the pamphlet, when can we expect the next work in the sequence? Is there an estimate for a month or a year it will be published? And what is the next work going to be? E.g. law, science, Will it be a full-length book?
Okay, so this pamphlet the term has become a problem because what's happened is what I call the folio, which is the thing the team asked us to produce in June. That's very close to complete, and it's around 50 pages. So it really is a pamphlet. It'll be less than 60 once you index and all that crap are on it. So that'll be a pamphlet. That'll come out. We've promised the team to get that out by the 10th, I think, something like that. And I think we're going to do it because right now we're just fussing with we're fussing with a few things in behavior, and then we have to write. I need the whole team together to write the introduction because I don't remember the acknowledgments in the introduction because I don't remember all the people that have contributed to this thing because it's ridiculous how many people have. So that'll get done. So that's going to come out. What do we think, in October or something? Is that what we think is going to happen
for the pamphlet?
Yeah, is that's going to come out October-ish?
Well, that's my virtual deadline. But as I know from experience working in software
Francis is the boss.
as I know from experience in working in a software development, it's ready when it's ready.
We're working very hard.
You can't rush developers, which is what this is.
Yes. Okay, the second book is what we used to call the pamphlet, and now we're calling the logic. This book is beautiful. It's actually a book. My thing about the pamphlet or the folio, whatever you want to call it, the 60-page one, is that great. If you know what we're doing, it's a quick reference guide that makes show you all the basic rules. Can you read it and understand it? I don't know. I certainly don't think so. I think what it is, it's a demonstration that if you know these 10 topics, you get it, right? And it's an outline or summary of those 10 topics. The logic is what we would consider the ternary logic, which is everything from the physics right on up through the law. And that book is turning out gloriously. The other one that we have in progress that I need, the problem is I need Martin and I need Brandon. But it's mostly Martin and I, but there's also stuff that Brandon's got to be there. And I wish it could be the four of us. Actually, I wish it was all of us. But I wish we could have Brad there as well. But Martin and I can do the law, right? We can do the Constitution. And I have to have Brand. You don't understand. I'm going to bring this up in the next question as well. It requires both of us to do it. You need both Martin and I to do it. I will be too optimistic. And Martin will be, I will say, too pessimistic. He would say, no, I'm just right. Go ahead. Say that's what you would think, Martin. Go ahead. Say it.
Obviously.
So it takes both of us to do it. And it's that balance between us that is quite necessary. So I feel I'm definitely healthy enough. Martin and I only tried this a little bit, but I'm definitely healthy enough to be able to do that. So we'll get that. The question of whether we produce that or the science first was hard. I think once we produce the logic, most of the science is in it, right? We just don't go into all the details. But if you want to understand the basic outline structure from it, the pamphlet's basically the index of the 10 basic sets of concepts and how they're broken up. Martin is working on, I don't know where you are in this, Martin. Where are you working on? Where are you on the basic concepts thing?
Just working on natural law right now.
Okay. So Martin, I think Martin is good. That's the one you actually probably want, right? The basic concepts that Martin is working on is probably what you actually want.
Well, I'm specifically formatting it as Substack articles, and it would.
You what?
I'm working on it as Substack articles, and it would need reworking to turn it into something printable.
Yeah, but we can do that. That's stuff we do already, right? The science is the book we need in order to teach this. Does that make sense? Right? In order to create a college manual, a college textbook, to be able to teach the whole series, we need the science. Do we need that before we need the Constitution? No. What we need is the logic, and what we need is the Constitution. So I view to answer the question, I view the next question as, the next book as soon as we're done with this, we're going to focus on the Constitution. Right, Martin and I. So the order they come out in, whether it comes out the logic first, the Constitution, I assume the logic will get done before the Constitution. I don't know, but it takes Martin and I to do the Constitution, and it takes Brad and I to do the logic. Right, that's basically it. Does that make sense? That we also have, remember, we also have the history, and we have the choice, and we have, which is the prosecution, and then we have some other, the history. So we have quite a bit to produce, so it's going to take us a while. So, but if the things you really are going to want are is probably the combination of the logic and what Martin is producing as the basic concepts. That's my opinion, what most people need. And then for us to be an activist organization that pursues political goals, we have to have the Constitution done. And that's just, I mean, Martin and I have worked, and Brandon have worked on this a lot. It is grunt work. I would love it if we could get Francis, Martin, Brandon, and Brad all together to work on that thing full time. We'd crank through it a full time. It would be like 4 hours a day, because it's about all any of us can handle. If we could do that, we'd crank right through it, because that's what it takes. But doing that is practically impossible. All right, so that's my quick answer to that one. I want to answer this next question. Can you do that really quickly?
Yeah, of course. So question 7, suggestion for MLI, introduce an option to have office hour questions answered as Twitter posts instead of video responses. Sometimes a concise written answer is more appropriate, allowing for direct responses with minimal deviation from the original question. Additionally, written answers are easier to retrieve for future reference.
Well, I mean, we do this. I mean, my response was like, dude, we do this already every day. Just ask. Just tag it that you wanted a Q&A, so I know it's actually, that level of importance. Then just do it. The reason I like the Q&A here is because you get Francis to take the moderator position and the position of the audience, and you get both Martin and my opinion. I think that's important. For the same reason I need Martin's opinion, is because we look at the world I tend to have the Anglo Island look at the world, and I overestimate certain things because of that. Martin has a continental view of the world, and he looks at the world from that perspective. I think our civilization is made of both of those, and so you need both perspectives. Most of the time I will say, yeah, Martin is right. I'm almost anything. But I feel like when Martin says something, he does something very discreetly and very concretely. And I like to say, let's understand why, right? What made this happen? What brings this about? And so I want to put that, because I think that's the education our guys need, not just the answer. If you give people the answer, they run with it, but they can't defend it. So that's why I think this format is really great. On the other, so just use Twitter, and if you want both Martin and I to answer it, just tag us both in it. It's not like it's difficult. Just tag us both in it and ask us to answer the question. One of us will get to it first, and that's how you get us to both do it. We do desire to chop these Q&A sessions into individual videos for each question, but that will require a group of volunteers willing to spend the time and effort to do it. And frankly, our team is pretty stretched as it is, which should have come across as we were already in our conversation today. So I understand your want. Please just do it. Do it already. That's great. Ask hard questions there. And you can we'll answer them. It's not a problem. It's just you won't get the same level, you don't get the same comparison or the same level of detail. In other words, you're not getting educated in why something is true very often. And it takes a while to write a Twitter post that's that. All right.
If I chop them up, do you want to flood the mine channel with them, or there's that unused clips channel?
I think the clips channel would be a great idea. Or if you just made another one. I don't know what the right one is, but the clips channel would be better. I mean, YouTube does make the shorts thing, right? Oh no, they wouldn't be shorts, right? They would just flood the channel. I don't know.
Nice.
I'm willing to do whatever you think is smart, Martin.
I guess if you chop them up like one video per question, obviously not every question, some just aren't worth it.
Yep. If you would do that, it would be huge value.
Yeah,
We have
some
tons of these
answers
I
might
think I'm gonna once again I'm gonna use this opportunity to call for volunteers. I look at this as a open source project. An open source project well contributed to some degrees. In fact, we have a project board with a backlog the more than it was enough work for us for years. So if anyone listening to this video is passionate about starting doing something like this, chopping these up to short YouTube shorts for consumption and so on, please do reach out to us.
Great. All right, are we done? Martin, you got anything else you want to add?
Nope.
Nope. Thank you. I'm glad you're back, Martin. All right, this is Francis, Martin, and Curt for the Natural Law Institute. It's Friday, August 30th. These have been office hours. We got through what? 8 questions? No, 7 questions. 7 questions. Pretty good. And we'll see you in what? 2 weeks? Is that how we're doing it? 2 weeks?
Yep.
We'll see you in 2
Back
weeks.
on the 2 week schedule.
Francis puts the link to where to submit the questions to us. Oh, I had one, and somebody sent me one today that I completely forgot about. So I'll add that to it.
Okay.
All right. All right. Thanks. Love you all. Thank you very much. Curt, Francis, and